Are you going to cover ISO and f-stop numbers quickly?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
What ISO is the best ISO and example?
Yeah. Does everyone understand what ISO and aperture and shutter speed all do? It's like the holy trinity in photography. And it's all to do with how much light is getting to the sensor and how sensitive the sensor is to that light that's coming in. So if you imagine the pupils of your eyes, right, when you go out into the dark, your pupils dilate in order for them to allow more light into your retina. When the sun comes out, your pupils go down to pinpricks because they want to reduce the amount of light that's hitting your retina. Well, that's what aperture means in the camera. It's basically how wide the hole is that lets the light get through to the sensor. And you get control of that with the aperture button on your camera. So what, right, we're still looking at my camera. So if I adjust, at the moment I'm at f1.4, so that's a really, really wide aperture. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, so the more light is getting into the camera. So if you want to shoot in low light, you really want to have a camera that's got a low number or a high aperture. Now, one of the effects, or the main effect of aperture, is what's called depth of field. So you'll see as you're looking at my timer, the background is out of focus. When I switch over to my camera so that you're looking at me, my background is out of focus. That's caused by aperture. That's what's happening there. So the range where the camera's in focus is very, very narrow. Now, if you're shooting on a 1.4 lens at, say, 85 millimeters, if you're taking portraits, you might find that your subject's eye is in focus and the tip of their nose is not. So that's how shallow the depth of field can be. And I'll demonstrate how that changes as the aperture adjusts. So I'll turn my camera around, I'll point to some things on my desk. So there's a bottle of water behind a mouse at f1.4. And I think I'm in manual mode. Yeah, manual exposure. So as I change the aperture, the depth of field is going to change, but so is the exposure. So it's going to get darker and darker and darker because I'm only adjusting one of those three things: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. So in order to compensate for that loss of light, when we change the aperture, we have to adjust another of those three things at the same time, but in the opposite direction. So when you're shooting video, you don't really have so much control over shutter speed as you do when you're shooting still images because of motion blur. So obviously when you're shooting stills, motion blur isn't a thing. When you're shooting video, it is. So the rule of thumb is that you want your shutter speed to be set to 2 times your frame rate. So in the UK, we tend to shoot at 25 FPS. I think in the US, you'll have 24 or 30. You want to set your shutter speed to be twice that number. So I always shoot at 25 FPS. So my shutter speed is going to be 50 and I'm not going to change it. So that only gives me one other thing I can change, which is the ISO. Now obviously, when the shutter speed changes, the amount of light getting into the sensor changes. With ISO, you're not actually changing the amount of light that's getting into the sensor. You're changing the sensitivity of the sensor. So I like to think of it as like a sponge. So if you imagine you're pouring water into a really, really hard sponge, the water's going to bounce off it. It's not going to soak into the sponge right away because the sponge is not sensitive enough to take that water in quickly. So if you imagine in this case, the water is the light. If you get a much softer sponge and you pour in the same amount of water, it's going to soak it up a lot more quickly. So when you're adjusting your ISO, what you're doing is you're changing the sensitivity of the sensor to soak up the light. So when you adjust the aperture, it gets darker, so we compensate by changing the ISO, and I'm going to go into auto ISO just to demonstrate. So you'll now see the camera adjusting the ISO automatically as I change the aperture, which should give you an overall similar exposure, but it will change the depth of field. So you'll see my water bottle coming into focus as I stop down, which is the term that's used for changing your aperture value. So now you see the ISO is changing. The camera's doing that for me as I manually adjust the aperture. And now 5.6, there's already a big difference in the depth of field. And now you'll see that Gerald Undone over here on my other screen is starting to come into focus. You can see my water bottle now. And that's as high as this lens will go, f16. But now see what's happened to the ISO. It's gone right up to 12,800 in order for the exposure to stay the same. So the camera uses its own algorithms to figure that out for you. So that's what aperture does, and that's how you get the blurred backgrounds that everyone seems to find so pleasing. I mean, look at Matt there. Matt Brighton sitting there with a blurred background. That looks phenomenal. So Matt just recently bought a capture card for his computer, which allows him to use his... What are you using? Are you using a Sony camera, Matt?
Yeah, A6400, and it's just kind of pull the wire away.
Same one I'm sitting with here.
So you can just kind of see the camera that's plugged in there, just HDMI.
So that's a USB capture device that converts the camera signal into HDMI to get into his computer. I'm doing a similar thing, but I have a capture card that's actually physically installed into my motherboard, which gives me an HDMI input. So that's how I'm able to switch cameras, because I've got two of them in my PC. And yeah, that's basically how you do it. So I have put a link to the capture card that I'm using in the Notion page, if anyone wants to go and have a look at it. Mine's quite old now, so it only supports 1080. If you buy one now, you'll probably get them that support 4K. It's not really necessary for streaming. 1080 is fine for streaming.
Cams, what lens was that you demonstrated the ISO on?
That's the Sigma 16mm f1.4.
Nice. Thank you.